Now on to our first session. Are we entering a post-cookie world? It is a question on the mind of many in the industry. Thankfully, the next session will explore the potential depletion of the third-party cookie and propose a range of solutions that can be considered by all stakeholders. I'm delighted to hand over to my colleague Tanzel, who's a managing director in EMEA at DoubleVerify, who is moderating this hotly anticipated session. Over to you, Tanzel.
Thank you, David. Good morning, all. I'm really looking forward to talking about this particular topic. I think it's dear to our heart, has been for many, many years. The cookie has been around for as long as I can remember. And it's an interesting situation where, as an industry, we're having to consider the challenges that a post-cookie era could create, but also the opportunities. And essentially, that's the core discussion that we'll be having with the panelists that you see here. Before we get to the panel, I want to introduce Daniel Knapp, who's the chief economist at the IAB Europe, to take us through a little bit of his insight into where he thinks the post-cookie era is going to take us. Daniel, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tanzel, and a very warm welcome from me as well. I wanted to give you a brief overview of where we currently stand and what some of the key considerations are as we're moving towards lower dependence on third-party cookies, and as we as an industry are all hard-pressed to come up with other ideas and solutions on how targeting, addressability, the use of data, and engaging with audiences can look like. I do not want to spend too much time, but really just provide a whistle-stop tour and kind of summarize key arguments. So I prepared a few slides, which I will share now. I do hope you can see my screen. Are the tides turning? We've been speaking since the dawn of programmatic about the idea of personalization, making ads more relevant. For 100 years, there has been that John Wanamaker claim that 50% of my ads are wasted, but I don't know which half. And we've always embraced this idea that personalization can fix all of this. And cookies have been a key infrastructure in fixing that issue. And indeed, it doesn't really come as a surprise, and maybe even fairly late if you think about it, that the ANA coined personalization as the marketing word of the year in 2009. But that was on December 4th. And just a couple of days later, Gartner, the analyst company, predicted that marketers, a vast majority of them, will abandon personalization by 2025. So is there some kind of personalization fatigue going on, or is this concept, which was a holy grail for the marketing industry, is it somehow under siege? And I think when we speak about third-party cookies, it's very easy, in particular from an industry association perspective, to fall into a technical debate. But we need to understand the wider context, the deal, the relationship we as an industry have to our audiences, and that all the different parties and partners in the industry, the B2B partners, have towards each other. We need to critically interrogate how could and should personalization be possible in this new era? And isn't the rise of the third-party cookie area also a criticism and a force for the industry to do some introspection to see what went wrong in the past and how can we provide more sustainable addressability and a more sustainable way of dealing with data and our audiences? And indeed, when I did some research on this, I think Mighty Hive presented a very, very nice kind of timeline on how the privacy narrative has evolved over time. And I took the liberty to expand on this type of visualizing things and highlight to you kind of a couple of milestones. Now, the industry is, of course, and we'll hear from Google in a second, really focused on the demise of third-party cookies within Chrome, a 2-year process, as the critical watershed moment. The moment where we are all thinking, scrambling about rebooting things. But if we look at our panel, we already have panelists on there who've, for much longer than this announcement, thought about how the future of the cookie, how the future of targeting could look like. And this privacy first area, as I would call it, has been in the making for quite some time. And there are just a few landmark events that you see on this timeline which have led to the moment where we are. It didn't come out of nowhere. We had data breaches, we had data scandals, we had regulators involved, we had the industry themselves, browser providers, browser manufacturers provide changes in how targeting should be. We had tech companies, with ad tech companies step in and say, we need to change the way in which we do targeting. So all these things kind of have led up to a new world, a new reality that we are all trying to figure out how is it going to look like? What future approaches to personalization can we think about? Right now, there are many solutions, many ideas, but in a sense, there are more questions than answers. And the key thing is we don't really know how, in particular on the Google side, the new world is going to look like. There are a few things that we already know, and I really look forward to Google's perspective on this in a second. But if we go to chromium.org, the key kind of repository where all things Chrome are being discussed, we can see a couple of things. Fundamental for the future will be the privacy sandbox, where we're moving towards a decentralized way of storing data, away from a centralized database to data and also calculation, computation on data being done locally in the browser and on the device. And around that, we can see very, very different types of analysis, analytics, and targeting options emerging predominantly through APIs. Many of those are work in progress and ideas and concepts and nothing that is firm, but it already highlights, if you look around what's on the screen, a couple of new ways of thinking about data, where it's less about identifying the individual, but using machine learning approaches, using statistics to create new segments and to do privacy compliant inference. And all of these APIs are embedded in what's now emerging, what's being discussed, a new privacy model for the web, about how should identities be resolved and what level of access and what level of granularity should be available. Now, while this is happening on the Google side, there are many other things the industry is already doing, a whole array of approaches, all new, on how in this post-third-party cookie world, targeting and addressability could look like. We see a resurgence of contextual targeting. We're seeing a massive launch of IDs, in particular publisher-centric IDs. So just today, news broke, for instance, that Axel Springer joined NetID, the big German publisher first-party ID association. We got measurement companies launching new panels, and we're also thinking about new types of ML approaches. And you can see how, when we think of contextual, for instance, as an example, it's more than just back to 1998 before we had the programmatic world. We see a couple of companies here in some kind of makeshift Lumascape that really illustrate the diversity of different approaches. From pure play contextual to something that is about brand suitability. You saw acquisitions on the space, particularly on the right side, something on video, and also very, very different, again, statistics and machine learning based approaches to understand context better. And the interesting thing is that many of these approaches come from Europe. We in Europe had a particularly, of course, stringent regulatory environment, which forced companies to think differently, to come up with new approaches. I think it's reflected in this new contextual landscape. We also see, we look at the ID landscape, just as an example, this is non-exhaustive. However, it highlights a few trends. We see often extremely locally driven, local and publisher-led initiatives, from NetID in Germany to the Swiss ID. Some are just publisher-centric, others are expanding beyond publishers to a broader group of industry participants, and others are extremely lean, because in some senses, publisher IDs, publisher consortia, they have a mixed history. Mixed history in the sense that some, due to governance issues, didn't work out in the past, so some countries adopted a much more linear approach. We see on the right side of this slide also many other approaches from the IAB. We see some first-party approaches and some unified ID solutions from very, very different providers in the industry, just to show you how much is kind of out there. But in all of this environment, whatever wins or what combination of approaches actually will gain traction, I think the marketer's to-do list is changing. They also need to move away from third-party cookies and move towards first-party IDs and build those in a compliant manner. And that means that analysis and insight are becoming much, much more important for them. It also means the industry needs new skill sets. We've often thought about data-driven skills predominantly in the programmatic domain, and this is the virtual programmatic day. But I think it's clear that if you look at advertisers' first-party data and the onboarding, that very, very different skills are required, and that the MarTech and the AdTech world are fusing much more together. The ability to combine programmatic knowledge with data analytics and CRM knowledge, and also how does the cloud function, how can I use data in the cloud, is becoming critical to unlock value of insight. And lastly, to conclude, I think all of this also shows that we need a shift in mindset. On the left, you see one of the earliest slides myself as an analyst did in 2009 on the programmatic world. And we see it's not really working like that anymore. And we've always thought about marketing in the last years as a science, but we need to think beyond that. It's not just a science. Data isn't just personal data, but it goes beyond that. We need to look beyond just the behavioral stream of data and think of other ways of thinking of audiences. We need to move away from certainty to approximation, but we have new tools to make that smarter. And despite all of this uncertainty, I believe that we have a historical chance now in the marketing industry, in particular in Europe, to set the foundations for a sustainable way of dealing with data and a sustainable way of understanding and interacting with audiences, finding a common language with other media, and also find the right balance from a regulatory perspective and a compliance perspective, and to create a level playing field where all parties can interact and transact and where data is moving out of silos. So with these introductory remarks, I would like to close and hand back to you, Tanzel, to introduce our panel. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you for the slides and the data, Daniel. Very interesting. I think it's interesting as an industry. We've always seen ourselves a little bit cyclical, and how the post-cookie world is already shaping up to learn from its past and sort of reborn some of the older technologies and the older way of doing things in a new ecosystem, but also leveraging some of the future technologies and how those two worlds will come together. I think is an interesting point to discuss later on in the panel. Before we do that, I want to introduce Sharon. Sharon Marshall. She's the Director of EMEA Partnerships and Solutions for the Data Trust at Google. She's going to sort of give us a little bit more insight into the Google Sandbox, I hope. As far as Google is in advancing web privacy, Sharon, over to you.
Okay, I hope everyone can see my screen okay and can hear me. Thanks very much, Tanzel, and thanks to the IAB team for inviting me to speak about Google's vision for web privacy today. What I would like to talk to you about is the reasons why Google wants to build a more privacy-safe web and do that together, and the steps for sharing your feedback and how you can collaborate in the process. So you heard previously, it's not news to anyone here that the ecosystem we all operate in is changing and has been changing for some time. Users are expecting more from us. For example, even in Google in 2019, we saw on average 20 million visits per day to the Google account. And the Google account is where users can choose and adjust their privacy settings across all Google products. So we can see that user demand for additional privacy has led to both increased regulation and stepped up controls from browsers. The industry is shifting to meet these higher expectations and impacting the ways data is collected and shared in the digital advertising industry today. These changes create new and important considerations for digital marketers and publishers. So we need to ensure the web can evolve to better respect user privacy, and at the same time, we need to ensure the web continues to support core business models that keep it working for everyone. But the same technologies which allow relevant ads, measure web traffic, or prevent fraud can also be used for unwanted tracking across the web. And primarily, we're talking about third-party cookies and covert tracking methods such as fingerprinting. So while users can control cookie-based tracking through browser settings, for example, they can't actually opt out of fingerprinting and often have no way to know it's even happening. And neither of these mechanisms is private by default. So it's really time for the web community to do more to respect user privacy and choice. At Google, we believe that abruptly blocking third-party cookies without replacement solutions would weaken the business models that fund quality content and keep the web widely accessible to users. It would also encourage more developers to resort to covert tracking workarounds such as fingerprinting. Google's approach aims to replace legacy practices with new privacy-preserving solutions. Now, that means finding ways now to improve cookie security and choice for users while we work on building privacy-safe alternatives to cookies. So just to take you through some of the key areas of focus that we're looking at. So improving privacy and security of cookies by partitioning first-party and third-party cookies and providing more granular controls for users. This is what we're referring to as same site, which I'm sure you've probably heard of. Chrome had planned to roll out this fully at the beginning of the year, however made the decision to temporarily roll back to ensure stability and avoid any distractions for websites during the COVID-19 crisis. But we do anticipate the rollout will resume later this year. While that's happening, we want to build privacy-preserving alternatives to third-party cookies to enable key advertiser and publisher use cases. And only when these solutions are in place, then phase out support for third-party cookies. Obviously, first-party cookies will remain unaffected. We also want to develop protections against covert tracking alternatives that I mentioned earlier, such as fingerprinting. The privacy-preserving solutions that I just referenced are what we're calling Chrome's Privacy Sandbox. I'm sure many of you have heard of this initiative already, and it's Chrome's way of championing the development of new web standards for privacy. It includes the creation of new technologies that support key web use cases without identifying users across sites, along with efforts to mitigate covert tracking workarounds by limiting passive data collection. When the new privacy-preserving solutions are in place and meeting the needs of the ecosystem, then Chrome intends to phase out support for third-party cookies. So the Privacy Sandbox has proposals aiming to address use cases, including measurement, relevance, fraud detection, and anti-covert tracking methods. I want to point out that the focus is on use cases because the objective is to achieve end goals. So for example, delivering relevant ads to users, but in a manner that preserves user privacy, not replicate every practice that exists today, because some of today's practices don't meet user expectations for privacy. All of Chrome's proposals to date, if you want to have a look at them, are listed on the Privacy Sandbox page of chromium.org. The Privacy Sandbox proposals are being refined through the public web standards process alongside privacy proposals offered by other parties. And each proposal will move through the web standards process separately. As these proposals are very early in the idea phase, or some of them very early, some might change substantially during this process or be replaced, and Chrome will continue to offer proposals to address additional use cases. And this initiative, is important to know, is not limited to Chrome or to Google. Other parties are offering their own privacy proposals as well, some of which Chrome will support or provide feedback on. And we want to invite the entire web community, browsers, technology companies, industry representatives and others, to help refine Chrome's ideas and also propose their own. The discussions around proposals submitted by Chrome and other members of the community are happening within the open forums of the World Wide Web Consortium, or otherwise known as W3C. This is generally how consensus is achieved for new web standards and how the best and most complete solutions are developed. Now, at this early stage, most organizations mainly want to stay informed, but you can decide the role you want to play in this process, and we encourage you to be as engaged as you want to be. You can stay informed by following developments, as I mentioned, on chromium.org, or read the Privacy Sandbox proposals on GitHub. If you have specific feedback to raise, you can comment directly on the Privacy Sandbox proposals in GitHub, or join one of the W3C communities or business groups. You can also engage through your industry associations, such as the IAB, who are already engaging with the process directly and are already members of the Improving Web Advertising Business Group. As the solutions proposed by Chrome and others become available for testing, you can experiment with them on your own or with partners in a more structured and collaborative model. And finally, if you do see a use case that needs to be addressed and have the domain expertise to propose a new solution yourself, you can get more deeply engaged in the web standards process. So I hope this has been helpful and shown you a little bit about how we're thinking about the web more private for everyone. And so I'm going to hand back now to Tanzil for the panel.
Thank you, Sharon. Very interesting. As I left Google 2.5 years ago, I think a lot of this was in ideation phase. So it's good to see a lot of it coming to fruition. So moving on to the panel, I want to introduce, obviously, we've heard from Daniel and Sharon. If you have anything further to do to introduce yourselves, then please do. But I'm going to ask everybody on the panel to introduce themselves. I suppose if we can go through in the order that we've got on the screen, that'd be great.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ben Hancock, Global Head of Programmatic Trading at CNN International, where I've been for about 5 years now.
Yeah, hi, I'm Richard Sharp. I'm one of the Senior Directors in Europe for Oracle Data Cloud, who are a data and technology company that helps publishers, advertisers, brands, agencies and platforms to better optimize their advertising on.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to IAB for having me. My name's Sarah Vincent. I work for Index Exchange, and my team heads up the publisher strategy teams across EMEA.
Good morning. I am Matthew Roche, the CEO and one of the founders of ID5. ID5 is a technology company building a privacy-first, cookieless identification solution for digital advertising.
Thank you. Daniel, did you want to say something before we get started?
Just say hi again. So I'm Chief Economist at IB Europe. Just maybe to say how I look at this. I've been an industry analyst for kind of the last decade, and I'm observing trends that shape the digital industry. So I'm taking kind of some impartial view during this discussion.
Fantastic. I suppose, given Sharon, you're the only one who's not introduced yourself. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, I can do that again. Hi, I'm Sharon Marshall. Obviously, you just heard I work at Google. I'm in the EMEA Partnership Solutions team and run a team that's very much focused on building data trust with our key partners.
Thank you all. So, in order to set the scene a little bit, the title of this panel is the post-cookie era. So I want to open up to the panel. I'll pass the mic to individuals as we go along. So the first question, I suppose, is, as an industry, as we prepare for the depletion or the demise of the third-party cookie, what opportunities and challenges do you think are created for the industry? Whether that's direct or programmatic. Let's start with Sharon. Given you've just done your presentation, I think it follows very nicely.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tanzil. So I think that there's challenges already with cookies today, and I think that's important to think about because we've seen, as I mentioned, a decline in trust from users. We see people using ad blockers, we see them going into incognito mode. So I think that what we can see as an opportunity for is to find solutions and really rebuild trust with our users. As I mentioned, it's early stages, but it's really key that we invest now in privacy-preserving tech that will actually mean privacy-preserving alternatives to satisfy critical business models and use cases. And the industry, I think, really has the opportunity to make meaningful improvements and set high standards across the whole web. So there's a really big opportunity for us to come together, and do this together. It's going to be challenging and it's going to require industry-wide collaboration. And so this is why we've set out a longer timeline, because we're really not expecting this to happen overnight. But we think that if we work together as an industry, we can really set high standards for the future.
Thank you. Matthew.
Yes. So we have to remember that user identification is one of the foundations of digital advertising. We've been using third-party cookies to identify users since the beginning of digital. And it's not been working particularly well, but it's been working. And over the past few years, we've started to face several kind of issues, growing issues. One is the efficiency issue, right? As I said, third-party cookies, we've had match rates issues, we've had kind of discrepancy issues, and that's been limiting the efficiency of the open web and programmatic for brands and publishers. So that's the number one issue. The new issues that have appeared over the past few years have been privacy regulation, because the ecosystem built on third-party cookies wasn't up to the standards that the regulators have imposed on us as an industry. And obviously the decision from the browsers, the unilateral decision from the browsers to shut down access to third-party cookies, which basically forces us to redesign the whole ecosystem. What we're talking about here really is a currency, is the ability to trade with each other, is the ability to connect a brand and a publisher so that they can use information that they have on either side to inform advertising, right? So it's a currency. We've been using third-party cookie IDs based on third-party cookie as a currency, as a mechanism to have a common framework to identify users. We don't have that anymore, right? So the challenge is, how do we redefine a currency? How do we redefine a trading mechanism so that we could continue to have brands engage with publishers on the open web in a manner that is more efficient, that is more respectful of privacy concerns and privacy regulations? So I think that's really the challenge we're faced with. I agree with Sharon, there are plenty of opportunities to do this better, because again, the previous ecosystem wasn't necessarily working well enough, in particular for publishers. But this is what's at stake here, is how do we rebuild, how do we redefine the currency that enables us to trade with each other?
Great, thank you. Sarah.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, I think my opening statement would be that opportunities this brings far outweigh the challenges. That said, I'm absolutely very aware of the challenges that we will face as an industry, one of which being time. We have 20-ish months to kind of really come together and rethink how this is going to be approached. And as Daniel said earlier, you know, like for example, Index has been thinking about this for a number of years, but we have to get to a point where now there's a timeline, there is really very much a call to action. So challenging, but also really exciting. And then in terms of the opportunities it brings, it as Matthew said, it's a time to really rethink the whole process. It's to use IAB's term, you know, it's like a re-architecture of the ecosystem and how it works. We're not looking to just replace, you know, the third-party cookie now. We should be thinking at, you know, let's look at the whole bigger picture. We have a real opportunity here to rethink and redo this system in a way that is absolutely user-centric, privacy-first, which it hasn't been in the past, and also would enable us to move into more deterministic, people-based marketing, which ultimately would improve the user experience.
Great, and Ben, from a publisher perspective, what do you think?
Yeah, hi Tanza, hi everyone. So I think I agree with what everyone's said so far about this. This has been a part of a wider ongoing narrative that we've seen. You know, we've seen issues around real concern from consumers that they're being over-targeted on the web. That's led to the rise of ad blocking and to the browser wars where they've been restricting what cookies can do. So I don't think anyone's really overly surprised that we're where we are. I think when we look at it specifically from a publisher's perspective, what we've got to bear in mind that it's the third-party cookie that's going away. First-party cookies really aren't going anywhere. So I'm sure we'll come onto it in more detail, but I think really bear in mind that the publishers are going to be in a really strong place with this, because absolutely we can still use our data, and we can really build on the capabilities that we've already got.
Thank you. You know, I think it's interesting from an industry perspective. A lot of people associate third-party cookies to retargeting and a targeting function. But I think it's important for everybody to understand that third-party cookies apply to so many more things across the internet rather than just targeting. I mean, basic functions like frequency capping, attribution, just general measurement is done through third-party cookies as well as targeting. And so, as we go through the rest of the panel and the rest of the questions, it'd be great to get your opinions on the impact beyond targeting for the industry and some of the solutions that we think we could use. So moving on to the next question, and to incorporate a question that we've had from Ben Geach, retargeting has been such a huge part of marketing tactics for direct response brands for years. Without cookies, what's the alternatives to get similar conversion rates? So, ultimately, I suppose the question is, will it still be possible to deliver targeted advertising in a post-cookie era? And how do we think we can do that? Richard, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tanzel. Yeah, well, the short answer to that is yes, we will be able to do targeted advertising in a post-cookie, a third-party cookie era. It'll just be slightly different. Everything that everyone said in the previous question, I agree with completely. And there's tons of opportunity here. We're just all going to have to get a little smarter. I think that anyone that comes out and says they're surprised with what's happened here, I don't know where they've been for the last 10 years. So the companies and brands and the publishers that have been treating the relationship they have with their customers and their users as a long-term relationship are the ones that are set up for this. Because it's all going to be, a lot of it's going to be about the use of first-party data and how you continue that conversation with them. Those that have not done that and have been doing far too much retargeting and treating their users as a resource rather than a relationship are the ones that are going to find this trickiest, are going to be the ones that are going to find this harder to match the revenues that they've been making from this, basically. But I do think that this is an exciting time, and we will be able to move forward through using targeting, first-party data firstly, but then also the excitement around things like context and those sorts of technologies that are out there.
Fantastic, thanks, Richard. Sharon.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Richard said, especially about sort of getting smarter with how publishers use first-party data, which a lot of them have a wealth of amazing first-party data. But I think it's important that the industry can still deliver relevant advertising that works well, not just for brands, but also for the consumers. And I mentioned earlier, we're seeing in the Privacy Sandbox that the proposals that have been submitted to forums and groups within the W3C, including from Chrome, but not just from Chrome, aim to support the core use cases. It might just look a little bit different. So use cases such as targeting, relevance and measurement are being developed for at the moment.
Great, thank you. Ben.
Yeah, hi. So I think absolutely it is going to change. I think when we look at this from a kind of the viewpoint of a publisher, if a lot of third-party cookies are going away or third-party cookies are going away, that first-party data is going to become more and more important, and contextual advertising is going to become more important. So if you look at what we've done at CNN, for example, and this has been part of an ongoing strategy for a number of years now, it's really been to invest in content outside of our news content that we're more known for. So, for example, we've got great style content, fantastic business channel. So we can offer contextual opportunities around there. I think also the kind of technology around contextual targeting has got a lot better as well. I remember about, contextual targeting, or keyword targeting as it was initially known, has been around for 15 years now. But we've got technology that really enables us to analyze our content semantically as well, so it can really analyze the full URL of a page and analyze the full text of a page as well, which is a really significant jump on. So I think we're going to see those technologies continue to develop, and that's how we're primarily going to offer this kind of targeting to our users. Also, we've got the ability to store our first-party data in a GDPR and privacy compliant warehouse as well, and then we can match that with other advertisers' first-party data and enhance both our data sets. So this is quite new, but I think that's a really exciting opportunity, and I really think we're going to see this grow in the coming years.
Great, thank you, Ben.
If I may just a quick comment, Tanzil. I think it's important to differentiate what we're talking about here. Data, whether it's first party, third party, is different from the identifier, the currency that we're using to connect the dots between buyers and sellers, right? It's always been super important for publishers and for brands to have access to their own data, because that's the data they control, that's the data they own, so it's cheaper, it's probably more specific to what they do. Right? There are use cases for third-party data. You cannot do prospecting on first-party data by definition, right? So data is one thing. The currency, the method that we use to connect data with inventory is what we've been using third-party cookie for. Irrespective of the quality of data, this is the connection that we need, right? And this is what's at risk. It's not that the access to data is one of the applications of that currency. Frequency capping is another application. Performance attribution is another application, right? What's at risk is that currency, is that ability to link a brand and a publisher so that we can do all those things. The quality of data is something that comes on top of this ability. If we don't have this ability to connect, it doesn't matter what data you have access to. You cannot bring it to the brand or to the publisher you want to use it with. So I think it's really important to differentiate first-party IDs, third-party IDs from first-party data, third-party data.
Thank you for the clarification. I think it's a great point. Sarah, finally, your version, your opinion on whether it still be possible to deliver targeted advertising in a post-cookie era from an index.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the answer is 100%. The contextual piece is interesting. Obviously, there has been some developments in that field in the last 6 months, which I'm really pleased to hear, because I was on a panel about 8 months ago, and we were talking about, when third parties disappear, the buyers were sort of saying more around, we'll just move to contextual advertising, which is a little bit blunt, but I'm hearing some really interesting feedback now from publishers that are, as you said, Ben, as well, that, you're thinking about how you can make contextual more relevant using, more audience segmentation, etc. So that's one way. The other way, and I feel let's not put too much focus on that. From the index point of view, we are much more focused on the people-based deterministic matching. And if we can facilitate the relationship building between the publisher and the consumer, you can deliver a much more targeted advertising experience for the user. So we've started doing this in the US. We've had some great success around buyers out there which have got their own CRM data, matching it to ID data that we're working with LiveRamp across certain publishers. And obviously match rates are incredible, relevancy is very high, and yeah, we're seeing the budgets grow on that. So the test case has been made, it's there and it works. It's just scaling it, and of course it does rely on a lot more data from publishers, which is kind of the next strategy for them as to how to obtain that and start building up their own graph.
I think, Tanzil, if I just may add, what's really important, just to elaborate on a point that Mathieu made, we need to think how data and how different sources of data can be combined, also and by whom, to facilitate an analysis. So we've talked about data, we've talked about matching, but we haven't really spoken about the analysis. How does it all generate insight and also then value? First point, if we look at the rise of first-party data right now, from a publisher side, that's great, but often publishers have a very limited view of who the audience, who the consumer really is beyond their own pages, which is why enriching this data, not just with advertiser data from the other side of the value chain, but also why building consortia or first-party consortia that go beyond publishers, for instance, include insurance, airlines, and so forth, is important to, first of all, increase the understanding of who the customer is. The second thing, when we look at a currency or the lack of a currency, is the question, if you match publisher data and advertiser data, who controls the analysis? If this is done in the future in a cloud environment, for instance, is that going to be Google Cloud? Is it going to be AWS? Is it going to be Azure or someone else? And I think we need to consider the role of the cloud and the ability to match data in the cloud and have control and transparency over the processes, how that happens, as essential for the future, so we can create a level playing field for all.
Thank you. You know, I think it's sort of interesting. You know, there's a need for the industry as a whole to reconsider what they're doing and how they're doing things. I mean, there's a question here from somebody on the webinar. I mean, is it time for marketers and advertisers to rethink their KPIs? You know, I think ultimately there's going to be a number of changes. So my next question is, you know, what will be the key actions we need to take as an industry to ensure brands can still engage with their consumers through relevant but digital advertising? Daniel, do you want to continue with your train of thought?
I think relevance is a key topic, and we always thought that relevance means hyper-personalization. But the marketer is ultimately interested in the individual person. I actually think that's a misconception. The marketer cares about target groups, about customer groups and segments. These can be micro segments, very narrow, but the individual person matters less. So I think it's actually a healthy move now towards saying, hey, we want to analyze how advertising works on a more aggregated basis, but still draw meaningful inferences from that. And I think in that way, targeting can still work. There's going to be a move. So first of all, we had a move from averages to individuals. Now we had taken Nielsen panels 14 to 49 to hyper-targeting individuals. That was really the promise of programmatic. But I think what we will be seeing now, supported by new ways of doing data analysis, is a move slightly away from the hyper-personalized from the individual to something more of an aggregate, not back to the world that we knew, but smarter aggregations and smarter segmentations that allows privacy compliant ways of understanding how consumers behave and how they react to advertising. So this is a combination of various factors, of regulation, of consumer fatigue with advertising. Behavioral hasn't often worked as well as it should, and the innovation in new statistical methods to really do this accurately and to do that at scale.
Great, thank you. Sharon, be interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Daniel that things are going to shift and look a little bit different. And I think that this is where to talk again about sort of how we work together, because it's important that we really work together across the ecosystem, and that's something. I think that's an action that we need to take now to really create industry-wide standards. I mean, 10 years ago, you wouldn't imagine that we would be able to do that, but I think that the industry is mature enough now for us to really look at this together. I mean, it's really important that everyone engages in the conversation, because we're all part of this ecosystem together, and no one company or entity is going to be able to solve this on their own. I talked about Chrome so far, but as an industry, we need to aim for solutions that would really work across all browsers. And in my presentation earlier, I mentioned a few of those use cases that we're developing for at the moment. But actually, we actively really want people to point out use cases we haven't thought of, and we need everyone's input in that. And we really need to think about how we work together to keep users at the center of this conversation, because it's really important. Someone was talking about building long-term relationships, and it's important to build that trust with our consumers and our customers and ensure they understand the changes and what that means for them too.
It's an interesting point you raised, Sharon. You know, understand the changes. You know, it sounds to me there's a real need for the industry, not just to talk to each other and talk at each other, but it's really just to educate. It's educate all constituents. I mean, from the consumer all the way up to publishers, advertisers, agencies, all the tech people, everybody in between. There has to be an open understanding. Matthew, I'd love to hear your opinion on this.
Yeah, fully agree about education. I'd like to come back to the point that Daniel was making earlier. Brands are not interested in individual consumers, they're interested in audience segments. And by and large, most of the cases have been segment level cases, right? With the exception maybe of retargeting, which can be considered more of a one-to-one type of approach. But apart from that, it's all about groups of users. The real question here, and the questions that we're faced with initiatives such as the Privacy Sandbox proposal by Chrome, is who defines the segments? Is it a Chrome definition, and we just get a group of users to work with, everyone has the same? Or do we want brands and publishers to be able to use individual user IDs to define the groups they want? And I think that's the main crossroad that we're at right now, right? And I believe that if we only allow brands and publishers to work with predefined groups of users, they'll be bringing a knife to a gunfight against the walled gardens. Because Google, in YouTube and in AdWords, isn't working cohorts. They're not working on segment, they're working on user level information. Same for Facebook, right? And so if all we give to brands and publishers to know their consumers, to address them in a customized way, to measure the performance of their action in a customized way is cohorts defined by someone else, they'll be really even at a more difficult competitive position versus the other destinations that brands have to put their money to, which is the walled gardens. So I think it's really important to understand this kind of crossroad that we're at. That being said, pushing user ID first. Sorry, Sarah, just give me one second to finish off. User IDs cannot be the user IDs we've had for the past 15 years. And so privacy first is non-negotiable, right? That's not an option. We need to include publishers, we need to include users in that conversation, and we need that relationship between publishers and consumers to be the basis of the identification system we're building for brands to be able to engage with consumers, right? We need to respect user choices by design. And so those are really the values that I think are important. A, we need to have user IDs. Brands and publishers need to have user IDs because cohorts are not going to be good enough. Two, user IDs have to be privacy by design. The infrastructure has to be privacy by design because users have to be part of that discussion. Maybe we have to explain the value exchange in a better way, right? We have to let them understand that if they get access to content and services for free, it's because those services are supported by advertising, and advertising requires some level of understanding of what they do, right? But that relationship has to be at the basis of the infrastructure we're building.
Absolutely. Sarah, you're going to interject that.
Yeah, if I could just add, I mean, Matthew, you really kind of summed up how I was thinking in response to Daniel as well. You know, like better targeting on segments makes a ton of sense, and that would absolutely be a step forward. But I think it has to come down at the end of the day to the one-to-one relationship, and that's what I think has to be core at the solutions we're trying to develop. Walled gardens have the one-to-one relationship with their users, and they then can segment them as they wish and do the analysis, as they choose to do so. But it all starts with that one-to-one. So, if we're looking to try and get the open web to become the trusted web and to bring parity with walled gardens, then we actually, absolutely have to be looking at that from the one-to-one from the very starting point.
Great, thank you. We've had a couple of questions.
If I can just add to that. So,
sure.
I agree with what you both said, and I think it follows the train of thought that I was developing as well, where I think the key focus beyond just the data is today also in who does the analysis, and how is the analysis, how is the segmentation, how is that transparent, and how is that auditable, and how is it customizable. And I think when we look at, and we can see how important that becomes when we also look at the history of regulation. Think about how arcane academic concepts like the right to be forgotten suddenly became law. We now see something similar happening, which is we're seeing regulation move away from the focus on data, which is about maybe about data collection, to something that could be, that's some academics call the right to reasonable inference. So looking at the consequences of computation, about what is being calculated. And while this is important from a regulatory point of view, shaping what's calculated, what's created in terms of segments from that individual data, Sarah, that you mentioned, Mathieu, that you mentioned, that is something that is important for the industry as well. And that's why I mentioned earlier that we need this level playing field, not only in data collection and access to data, but also in creating aggregates, creating insights from data that can be used.
Thank you. I was just going to say, there's a couple of comments that have been put in the Q&A section. Paul Dimmock suggests that projects like the Ozone Project can also help in that similar consortium type world where publishers can come together to provide cross-publisher data. So the first-party data and not being able to target individual publishers are being sold for by the industry. Paul Gubbins also mentions here that there's potentially an opportunity. We're seeing with COVID-19 a shift away from content on social platforms towards reputable news publishers. Given that a lot of these publishers may or may not have paywalls, is there an opportunity for them to evolve their strategies and sort of move into a free wall type environment where they can capture first party data, where they can capture new users? Ben, I'd love to understand from you, from a publisher perspective, what do you think are key actions that the industry needs to talk, and if you can sort of allude to publishers, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I saw Paul's comment as well. Actually, I think I get what he's saying. I think it's actually quite interesting that a couple of publishers have actually removed their paywalls at this time as well. So if you notice the New York Times, all of their COVID-19 content they've taken away from behind the paywall. So interesting to note there. But I think what this really does, as content data become much more important for publishers, becomes more valuable, I actually think this creates an incentive for publishers to focus more on these and invest more resources into this, into content and into data. And I think specifically on your question about what we need to do as an industry, I think education, first and foremost, of the general public, the people that actually consume our content. It's great that we're all sat around having conversations like in this industry. We've seen the kind of occasional sort of spike in news, which I think often, as far as we're concerned, kind of I think that really brings home its importance. I think that the sort of implicit value exchange between publishers and their audience, I think that's been there, but it hasn't really been explained as well as it could do by the industry or at all for that matter. And I think actually what's happening at the minute, we're in the midst of a global pandemic, and I look to all the premium news outlets, and I think it's incredibly important the work that we're doing, and absolutely that this is it's so important that this continues, and maybe there's an opportunity for publishers to kind of do better at that education piece.
Great, thank you. Just conscious of time, so I'm going to combine a couple of questions here, and I'd like Richard to answer this next one if possible. I think there's we talk a lot about ID, and we talked a lot about user targeting. I'd love to understand a little bit more of the impact of these changes across other aspects of our industry, right? So things like measurement and attribution and frequency capping. Richard, I'd love it if you could talk to, what are some of the other evolutions that we've seen in the industry that enable us to continue to deliver value both to brands, publishers, and the ecosystem at large?
Sure, thank you. At Oracle Data Cloud, we're very fortunate to have one of our businesses is the global specialist for measuring advertising modes. We will be able to continue to give measurement analysis to our publishers, to our platforms, and to our advertisers, because all of the measures we use there or do there does not require a cookie. So we're going to be able to show advertisers what content, where their attention is coming from. So it's beyond verification. It's beyond that kind of table stakes ideas about advertising that we've had in the past. It's really bringing to life to a brand or a publisher how exactly people are interacting with them, and what is making their advertising effective, and how they are achieving their return on investment. One of the things that I'm really interested in, I think it's quite interesting, this panel has really kind of turned towards content and how important it is that to users to be looking at the right content that's reputable, that's accurate, that's correct. We with Moat are now able to show our advertisers and our brands exactly how people are interacting with their content. So motors advertisers in the past have always turned around and said, look, I know that someone that looks at sports editorial is going to, I get a great return on that advertising. They're the type of people that I want to be talking to. We're now actually going to be able to prove to them whether that is correct or wrong. We're also going to be able to prove to them that actually, at the same time, people that are interested in gardens are also interacting with their brand and are delivering value to them. So I think it's that measurement that's going to be the important thing, and finding alternatives to show that they can be effective there and bring that story to life. I think what Ben was saying around the content and showing and giving a better value exchange, you can't do that unless you've got the measurement to show you where that value is coming. If you can see that your consumers are interacting with this part of your website in this sort of way, and at the same time it's giving value to your advertisers because they're also interacting with the adverts, then that's the stuff that we should be doubling down on if we want to keep a free internet. If we're not going to have that, then paywalls are going to come up more and more, because at the end of the day, to deliver that quality editorial, that quality story, it's got to be paid for. But if it can't be funded by advertising, it's got to be funded in other ways, basically. So that's the stuff that's really getting us excited at ODC, is how can our measurement really deliver on that for them, using our contextual insights and then bringing that into our measurement suite for solutions.
Thank you, Richard. It's really interesting. I think I absolutely agree with you. I think we at Double Verify are doing something very similar. I think this narrative of evolution is key. You know, if we look at the verification industry, there's so much data. It's not just the verification, it's all technology. I mean, in most cases, there's so much more data around consumer engagement, consumer exposure to ads than we ever give any credence to. And so the exposure and the ability for us to change that narrative, to evolve from measuring to driving performance, is so key as an industry. Ben, would love your opinion on the same question, impact on measurement and attribution, and also evolution of technology.
Yeah, so again, I think this creates a real incentive for publishers to invest in technology, whether it's their own. You know, I dare say we're going to see from bigger publishers, you know, creating a lot of their own technology now, and again, that creates a point of difference in the marketplace for them. I think measurement, crucially, I think again, what we effectively lose with the deprecation of the third-party cookie is the ability to measure this across like massive swaths of the internet. You know, those days of you know, these big campaigns that target thousands of publishers. You know, we're not really going to do those kind of campaigns in a way that we did in the past. So I think that brings measurement back more to individual publishers. And I think there's an advantage there for larger publishers that have got multiple sites. You know, we run, you know, across Warner Media, we have multiple websites, and it's all first party data, so we can measure and we can attribute across all of those websites still with the use of a first party cookie. So again, I think this kind of shifts how premium publishers should approach this, and really puts them in the driving seat for these kind of measurement driven campaigns. Just on that as well, I think by its nature, if brands, advertisers, marketeers can't as effectively do these heavily measurement driven campaigns, I think maybe we're going to see a shift towards more one-to-one type campaigns where brands are working directly with publishers. Perhaps more kind of upper funnel campaigns are going to be we're going to see a lot of growth with them within publishers as well.
Great, thank you. And I suppose the last question for me, and once again, I'm going to combine a couple of the questions. You know, with any significant change to any ecosystem, the impact across all the constituents of that ecosystem is profound. I suppose the question is, you know, which players or which of those constituents across our ecosystem are well placed to benefit from this, and who requires a rethink? And then secondly, I mean, I'd also appreciate a comment around what's the impact on consumers with the removal of third-party cookies, and will that have any influence on what solutions as an industry we find to replace them? Daniel, I'd love your opinion on this first.
I mean, everyone is very busy rethinking right now, but I think the risk is, that we're seeing the kind of the gulf between the data haves and the data have-nots widening much more quickly, where those that combine very deep granular first-party data in a very scaled manner, plus the ability to analyze that data, i.e. the platforms, move out of this even stronger. That is a risk. And it's a risk ultimately also, not just for other participants, but that could also be a risk for refinancing news, media pluralism, and so forth, which is why it's so important that we have an engagement across the industry about not just who controls the data, but who analyzes it. I see a huge potential for publishers in local markets, more so than in the US, because if we think of markets like Germany and France, they're much more supply-side driven than the US, for instance. A huge potential for strong publisher alliances to come out of this stronger, but they need to do things differently than in the past. If we look at the history of alliances and cooperatives, many have failed because of ill-conceived governance structures, because everyone wanted to extract profit from it and not give something into it. So these things need to change from a governance perspective, from an investment perspective, from the publisher side. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, to make this successful, one needs not more of the same data, so more of the same narrow vertical data from the publishers, but the data needs to be enriched by larger collaboration, for instance, from advertisers or other sectors in the industry. If that happens, I'm quite optimistic about the role of the publishers, but if it doesn't happen, I see a stronger shift to the platforms.
Great, thank you. And Sarah, I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, so those that are going to benefit, I think, are those from our point of view, like we're seeing publishers who are kind of forward-thinking, who are defining their first-party data strategies now. We feel that they're going to be the ones that will benefit probably initially from this. We've, have seen examples of them testing different strategies, which is a great thing. Like there is no sort of holy grail and one solution, and that applies to many aspects of the ecosystem. So testing different solutions on the publisher side, how to collect that first party data, how to understand what that value exchange is, how to change the mindset. Any publisher that's thinking about that now, I think, will benefit in the longer term. And then on the other side, you've got the buy side as well, which again needs to look at rethinking perhaps the measurement, as we've said. If we can continue this education piece across the different players, we can actually have much more collaboration, then as together we will benefit more. So it's really a question that, I'd say the forward-thinking publishers and the forward-thinking players that are actually testing, trialing stuff right now, seeing how it works, understanding the value exchange with users, and building that trust will be those that benefit most initially.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Matthew?
Yeah, fully agreed with the point made by Daniel about the gulf between the platforms and publishers and brands, and the risk that they come out even stronger if we are limiting the ability of the independent players to use data at scale. The real risk is for publishers not to have the means to compete, and for brands not to have a choice of where to invest their money, right? That's really what we're looking at, which in turn presents a risk for publishers to be able to sustain the production of content through an advertising business model. So that's where we're looking forward. There's plenty of opportunities to build a better ecosystem, right? And to use this challenge to build something that works better for publishers, for brands, and for consumers. But we need to lean in. We need involvement, because this is not something that can be decided by one side of the ecosystem. So we see publishers getting together and kind of working on consortium. That's a great initiative. We see ad tech vendors adopting some of the solutions that are available out there. That's a great initiative. We haven't seen much involvement for brands and buy side and agencies yet. So we need their involvement and their participation as well, because this is something that has to be redesigned at industry level. In the end, it's an ad tech evolution. ad tech has been the conduit for that transaction to happen, and we need ad tech to redesign the way that we identify users, and that takes everybody's involvement. So that's a great challenge, but that's also a great opportunity if we can redefine this in the next few months.
Great, thank you. I think Marie-Claire is virtually banging on the door for us to finish up. So thank you very much to all the panelists. I think it was a great discussion. As with all of these type of things, there's never enough time. There's a whole bunch of questions, and I mean, I think across the panelists will review the questions and respond accordingly. Just to summarize, I suppose, I think as an industry, we've seen the writing on the wall for some time. I think we're now, given the timelines involved, being pushed to accelerate our evolution. And I think it's interesting as an industry, there is still so much we need to do in terms of education, in terms of collaboration, that even after 20 years in this industry, those key foundational components haven't changed. The evolution that we're seeing, the sort of the key developments we're seeing from a lot of players in the industry should do, if nothing else, provide everybody with an opportunity to look at what they've done, look at how they've done things, understand what other tools and technologies are available in this new ecosystem. And one of my favorite quote, simply because I made it up, is challenge the status quo. Right? It's no longer enough to continue to do the things that you've always done. There are so many new technologies. There's so many different changes in the ecosystem happening that taking having introspection, looking at the way you do things, looking at the technologies that you use, and ensuring that you're optimized based on the best technologies, the best data, the best opportunities, the best relationships, and ultimately the best experience for the consumer. So thank you again to all the panelists. Thank you to the IAB for having us on here. And I'll pass back to David Goddard, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Tanzil, and thank you all for an incredible panel discussion and for sharing your insight into a complex challenge that we all need to be mindful of. So in that panel, we ran a couple of polls, and I'm just going to announce the results of those. So the first poll that all of you kindly contributed to was, what does the depletion of the third-party cookie actually mean for the programmatic buying and selling? The answers, or the options you had to choose, was large decrease in programmatic trading, some increase in programmatic trading, no change, some increase in programmatic trading, a large increase. So that was decrease to increase, obviously. The results are large decrease in programmatic trading was 13%, some decrease in programmatic was 56%, no change was 18%, some increase was 9%, and a positive 4% for large increase as well. So thank you for that. And the second poll was next poll results, which was, do you think consumers will benefit from the depletion of the third-party cookie? Yes, 33%, no, 20%, and not sure if they'll notice, 47%. So they were two cracking polls. Thank you all for participating. Look out for more of those. Now, if you're keen to learn more about this topic and that was just discussed, please do look out for IAB Europe's post-cookie guide, which will be providing more detail on the challenge and solutions in development. So this will be published hopefully next week. I also want to highlight IAB Tech Lab Project REARC, as it is an initiative that we all can consider getting involved in. Project REARC is a global call to action for stakeholders across the digital supply chain to rethink and re-architect digital marketing to support core industry use cases while balancing consumer privacy and personalization. So the IAB Tech Lab is orchestrating a collaborative process to educate member and non-member stakeholders to facilitate global input into the development of a new technical standards and guidelines driving privacy by default, addressable advertising and measurement. So we will share more on Project REARC, details on Project REARC in the Virtual Programmatic Day follow-up that you'll all be receiving as well.